For decades, the murder of a 30-year-old woman whose body was found along I-10 in the middle of the desert went unsolved. But advances in DNA technology have allowed some semblance of closure for Sherry Herrera's for children with news of an arrest of a man believed to be the murder suspect. Herrera was only 6 years old on March 30, 1993. That's the day the body of his mother was found dumped at the I-10 exit of Hayfield Road near Desert Center. It's a day Herrera said he'll never forget. Sherry Herrera was from Tulare County in the Central Valley. So how did her body end up alongside a freeway in the Southern California desert, about halfway between Palm Springs and the Arizona state line? That remained a mystery to investigators. In the early 1990s, the processing and testing of DNA evidence was still in its infancy, but Hestron said because investigators were so diligent in processing the scene, it allowed their cold case unit the opportunity to reopen the murder investigation about a year ago. Hestron didn't specifically address what they found that allowed them to crack the case, but said potential DNA evidence from the murderer found at the crime scene matched DNA evidence found at another murder crime scene in the state of Texas. That murder was committed in 1992. The suspect in the Texas murder case and person of interest in the Herrera case has been identified as 68-year-old Douglas Thomas. At the time of the murders, Hestron said he was a long-haul truck driver. Now retired, Texas authorities said he was arrested on suspicion of murder at his home in Waco. Adrian Herrera said investigators told him that the DNA match that led authorities to Thomas didn't come from Thomas himself. Herrera was allegedly killed during the commission of a rape. According to prosecutors, potential DNA from the killer discovered at Herrera's crime scene matched DNA found at the Titus County murder scene. Authorities said Thomas will be prosecuted in Texas first, and then Riverside prosecutors will request that he be extradited back to California to face his charges in Herrera's murder. After Captain James Tappan Hall was shot to death in Rockville, Maryland in 1971, the mysterious killing remained unsolved for decades. Now, over 50 years later, officers where he worked say they've finally nabbed his killer. Larry David Smith, formerly known as Larry David Becker, 71, was a person of interest from nearly the beginning of the half-century-long quest for justice. He now stands accused, formally, of murder and allegedly confessed to the crime in early September of 2022. Hall was a special deputy sheriff for Montgomery County and is believed to have interrupted a burglary already in progress. At approximately 10:40 p.m. on Saturday, October 23, witnesses entered the Manor Country Club in the 1400 block of Carrollton Road and reported that there was a man lying face down in the southeast parking lot with trauma to his head, the MCPD wrote in a press release last year. Police and fire rescue responded and discovered Captain Hall suffering from a gunshot wound to his head. The victim succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. Becker was initially interviewed by investigators in 1973 but was not officially named as a suspect. Time passed, the case went cold, the file was shelved, and the questions lingered for decades. In October of 2021, the department reopened the case, terming it an ongoing homicide investigation. Those renewed efforts allegedly bore fruit. For almost a year, Detective Leggett and Corporal Killen of the Cold Case Unit combed through case files, recordings, and interviewed witnesses, the MCPD said in a recent press release. Through the course of their investigation, Leggett and Killen narrowed in on one person, Larry David Becker. According to the police department, the cold case investigators learned that Becker began using the last name Smith in 1975 and moved to upstate New York, where he had been living for over 45 years. And after learning that information, it was off to the races. On September 1, 2022, Leggett and Killen interviewed Smith in the Empire State. During that interview, the suspect allegedly confessed to shooting Hall. Later that same day, the detectives applied for and received an arrest warrant that charged Smith with Hall's murder. Smith subsequently waived extradition and will likely be back in Maryland by the end of the September 2022, police said. During a press conference, Montgomery County officials from various agencies praised the detectives' work. They have been dedicated and committed to finding justice, Chief Marcus Jones said. We have never shown that we have given up on finding justice for this case. They have persevered in a manner that demonstrates the high quality of Montgomery County Police. To obtain a confession for someone who committed a crime 51 years ago is a tremendous accomplishment, the chief went on to say. And though the lone suspect is currently charged and in custody, the MCPD says the case is an ongoing investigation and are still asking for the public's help with any additional, relevant details. The apparent solving of Hall's murder is the oldest cold case the department has closed. Lieutenant Kenneth Sanger of the department's Major Crimes Division said the case will now be handed over to the state attorney's office, who intends to take it across the finish line. A cold case is finally solved nearly 34 years after a young woman was murdered. The FBI has been working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to use new technology to finally bring the family of Stacy Lynn Kahorsky some peace. This is a historic case. The FBI said this is the first time in the country when both the victim and the killer have been identified by forensic genealogy. Special Agent Joe Montgomery worked on Stacy's case without knowing her name or identity for nearly a decade. He had an old photo of her in black and white, and all this time, he was trying to fill in the blanks. He added, "To me, it's incredible. Because as an agent, you live with these cases." Stacy was 19 years old when she went missing. A body was found in December 1988, but law enforcement weren't able to identify it. In 2005, the DNA was entered as a Jane Doe into the missing persons database. In 2015, her murder was assigned to the cold case unit. In March of 2022, Agent Montgomery finally got to call Stacy's family and tell them she had been identified through forensic genealogy nearly 34 years after her death. In August 2022, her killer was identified the same way. Law enforcement identified the killer as Henry Frederick Wise, who went by Haas and drove a truck all over the Southeast. He also worked as a stunt driver in South Carolina. He was killed in a stunt accident at Myrtle Beach Speedway in 1999 and burned to death, Montgomery said. Wise died before he could face justice for killing Stacy. He died 23 years before Stacy was ever identified. It was traced back. Wise had a living relative who was interviewed, cooperated, and it was matched to Wise, FBI Special Agent in charge Kerry Farley said. Forensic genealogy uses the DNA from the suspect or the victim's living relatives, but Agent Montgomery said it takes investigators to make the connections. Agent Montgomery said, "It's like another lead to run down. It develops a profile, but then you have to go through different relatives and it's almost like a tree and you're working your way back to the trunk." In this case, he said the limbs of that tree lead back to Henry Haas Wise and Stacy Kahorsky. DNA from coffee cup solves 1975 cold case murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beechler. In July 2022, one of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases was solved when David Sinopoli, 68, was arrested for the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Beechler. Lindy Sue Beechler was only 19 years old when she was found stabbed to death in her apartment home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on December 5, 1975. She had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed 19 times in her chest, back, and neck. The young girl also had defensive wounds, showing she fought hard for her life. According to reports, the knife was still in her neck when she was found. Police interviewed as many as 300 people, consulted crime experts, and launched a task force. However, the crime went unsolved for nearly 5 decades. On July 18, 2022, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams announced that a suspect had finally been arrested for Beechler's brutal murder. David Vincent Sinopoli, 68, of East Hempfield Township, Pennsylvania, was charged with criminal homicide. Adams said, "We are here today due to advances in DNA technology." The cold case one was the oldest unsolved ones in the county, and after all those years, a discarded coffee cup helped lead to the arrest. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, genetic genealogist Cece Moore of Parabon Nanolabs determined that Beechler's murderer likely had ancestors from Gasparina, a small town in Italy. Moore then cross-referenced that data with family trees from Lancaster County, and this led her to Sinopoli, who was still living in the same county. Once Sinopoli was on the investigators' radar, authorities started surveilling him for months. When they spotted Sinopoli tossing out a coffee cup at the Philadelphia International Airport, they retrieved it for DNA testing. His DNA was then tested, and it matched the DNA that was found in the victim's underwear. Sinopoli had lived in the same 4-unit building as Beechler. No other known connection between Beechler and the alleged killer has been reported. Sinopoli was arrested at 7 a.m. on July 17, 2022, at his Pennsylvania home. He is now in custody and is being held without bail at Lancaster County Prison. Adams said, Lindy Sue Beechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home. The arrest of David Sinopoli marks the beginning of the court process, and we hope that it brings some sense of relief to the victim's loved ones and to the community, who for the past 47 years have had no answers. The family members of Ronald Cates, a man accused of killing his friend in Orlando in 1992, came forward to law enforcement to help solve the Orange County cold case, investigators announced during a news conference exactly 30 years to the date of the crime. During the early morning hours of August 10, 1992, deputies responded to a home on North Forsyth Road after the wife of 53-year-old John Stagner found him beaten to death in his bed. Orange County Sheriff John Mina said he had head and facial trauma. Investigators said Stagner was a hard-working maintenance employee for Orange County and was living on the county's maintenance property at the time of his death. The sheriff's office had suspected Cates, who had been a person of interest from the start, committed the crime, but Mina told reporters they didn't have probable cause to make an arrest. Cates reportedly had a drug habit at the time and would often borrow several power tools from Stagner and pawn them to buy drugs. Stagner had reportedly confronted him about it and asked him to return the tools. On the day of the murder, detectives went to his house to speak with him about the case, but he reportedly had his daughter lie and say he wasn't home. Investigators later learned he was hiding under the home that day. They spoke to Cates the following day and again on August 18, 1992, and said there were inconsistencies in the timeline he gave and what his family members were saying. The case kept going, and in 1995 there was a suicidal incident where Cates reportedly admitted to his family that he killed Stagner, the sheriff's office said, but because of how evidence and technology was at the time, there wasn't enough to charge Cates. In 2020, a family member of Cates contacted OCSO about the cold case. The family really cared about this case, even if they were the suspect's family, because Mr. Stagner was very, very good to the Cates family. He would give them money at the time when they needed it or a place to stay, Detective Kevin Wilson told reporters. Detectives started looking into the case some more and spoke to Cates' daughter and wife, and in March 2022, they began more extensive interviews with family members. Wilson said they were in fear of Mr. Cates their whole lives because he was very abusive to them and they were in fear of him. In April 2022, Cates, who was in a hospital in North Carolina, allegedly told a nurse he had killed someone in Florida in 1992. OCSO said she then told a security guard, and they did research, and found the 1992 case on the sheriff's office's website. Officers with the Salisbury Police Department in North Carolina responded to the hospital and obtained Cates' confession on body camera video. The sheriff's office said Cates didn't explain the motive of the murder during his confession. He just explained more or less that he hit Johnny with a stick, Wilson said. Cates reportedly used a walking stick to get around, according to his family, and the stick was found at the crime scene. Detectives said there was enough evidence at that point to be able to interview Cates again and charge him with Stagner's murder. Cates was arrested on August 5 on a first-degree murder charge and is being held in a North Carolina jail, awaiting extradition to Florida. Mina said the sheriff's office started its cold case team in 2020, and since then, the team has solved 13 cases dating back to 1984. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the video, and click the bell icon to stay tuned.